Pete Yost here for the Unbuild It podcast with a word about our sponsor, Huber Engineered Woods. There are really three reasons why I think Huber Engineered Woods stands out, and it's a big part of why they're a sponsor of our Unbuild It podcast. First, they develop systems of products. The products are compatible and integrated. Makes our jobs a lot more easy in the field and when specifying. Second is superior tech support. There are really good website resources that they have developed for the application of their products, but they also have an outstanding 800 numbered tech team that really knows their stuff. And the last is a really active technical research and development team with whom I've done a lot of work over the years, and I have a lot of faith in the information I get from them when I have questions about product performance. So that's it. That's our high performance sponsor. Now on to the podcast.
Well, good day, Unbuild It podcast. Steve Basic here. Guess who I got with me? Yeah, it's probably not a hard guess. Peter Yost, Jake Bruton, Unbuild It podcast team.
Howdy.
We're here, but more importantly, you're here. And by that, I mean, it's a good day for some Q&A. Let's bring the listeners in. Let's bring those questions in, and let's have a discussion. So without further ado, no, Peter, you're not allowed to talk at this time. Jake, please, question one.
Per our normal format, I'm the only one willing to read out loud where our listeners can hear. This message comes from Sean. This one actually came through Instagram. I have to edit it a little bit because he uses some names that probably don't want to be used. Hey, mate, I was talking to a friend.
Hey, mate, he's Australian.
He is Australian. And he mentioned that you've been doing the Airtight drywall approach successfully. I think he's mentioning you and I working with the lid as our air barrier. I'm looking to do that on an upcoming project in Australia.
Mate.
What?
I said, I, mate.
Okay. In Australia, we don't really sheathe houses, and we use mechanically attached quote unquote house wrap, making it continuous from the tape, and all the seams. I've had a look at Building Science Corporation's website, and they have a good how-to style article that I'll be following. I'm just wondering if any of you have any further tips on the matter. So I will tell you that because it came through Instagram, I answered it a little quicker, and the answer that I did provide was Myron Ferguson. Like, if you better than BSC, which I know we don't normally say, better than BSC, Myron has written extensively on this for Fine Home Building, for JLC, and I've seen multiple videos out there that may have been Fine Home Building or JLC. That is my first go-to. That's my Pete's resource for this episode. But let's talk about what Airtight drywall means. Oh, Myron is that drywall guy on Instagram, if you're not following him already.
Oh, that drywall guy. You know what I find interesting, before we even get into what that means? All three of us have recently been at a talk where one of the speakers basically said, you can't use drywall as an air barrier, which I find pretty interesting, because if I walked right up to that wall, put my lips to it in blue, I think I would consider it an air barrier.
It's also interesting because when they were trying to establish what constituted an airtight material, guess what they used?
Drywall.
Half-inch drywall.
As their baseline.
0.02 liters per meter per second at 75 pascals. That's what half-inch drywall is.
0.02 liters per meter per
second at 75 pascals pressure difference. That is the material standard that the Air Barrier Association of America uses. It's in the ASTM standard. I don't remember which number, but that's what makes it kind of funny.
Just so we're clear, that ABBA is my second favorite ABBA.
But
yeah,
here's the other
ABBA backwards real fast.
ABBA.
Here's the peculiar thing about this is that when you go from the standard for an airtight material to the standard for an airtight assembly, that number loosens by tenfold, right? So An assembly is 0.2 liters and a material is 0.02 liters per the same rates. And what that means is that you better start with an airtight material, because as soon as you put it in an assembly, you're going to have leaks. And I think that's where people get lost with airtight drywall, is that to move from an airtight material like drywall to an airtight assembly, getting all the details right to deliver the assembly in a comparable way is hard. Unless you're Myron Ferguson.
Sure. So number one,
before we get to that, in the future, can you say, instead of what is peculiar, can you please use what I find to be peculiar? I'm not comfortable with you just assuming that I agree with you.
With your peculiar your assessments.
I can't say what I find. I can't.
No, you can, but you didn't say that. You said what is peculiar, assuming that I agree with your peculiarities, which I don't.
Yeah, there's zero chance of that.
I think we can infer it was his opinion that he was giving.
Well, he likes to be literal. He doesn't like inference all that much.
So
I'm trying to be correct.
This is one of those really cool. They do it different someplace else in the world, and we wouldn't know unless we know sort of things. You and I, Steve, have proven that we can build houses below passive house levels of air leakage with at least drywall as part of the air barrier assembly. You and I have used it most successfully as the lid or the ceiling.
Yes.
The challenges with that are the same on some level when you start to use it as the wall.
The wall is far more of a challenge.
That's where I'm headed, because we have light fixtures, we have smoke detectors, we have ceiling fans on the ceiling, and on the walls we have light switches, we have receptacle boxes, we have potentially, wall mounted HVAC systems,
windows,
we have doors. So there's more holes.
Yeah.
And then, relatively speaking, none of my clients are nailing nails to hang pictures from the ceiling. They don't have access to damage the air barrier on the ceiling.
Yeah, I think the major difference is the number and the size of penetrations. It's just a whole different ballgame with walls than ceilings.
Yeah, I have one house where we actually did the airtight drywall approach to the whole house. And I want to say our airtightness was probably somewhere in like a 1.2 range.
Not bad.
So no, it's not bad at all. I don't think we don't have one under 1 that I know of where we constituted the primary air barrier as the drywall wall.
And the other thing is that with a continuous layer of ceiling drywall where you've eliminated all the interior partitions, right? You can't do that on the walls. There are intersecting partitions that are, I guess you could.
You'd have to run that long and then frame the interior wall up to
Yeah.
it.
Well,
and
in fact,
what
they
about
do
floor
quite
assemblies?
often.
What about floor assemblies?
That's always the challenge with bringing it to the interior.
Yep.
Quite often in commercial settings, the T-walls are framed back because they're non-structural. Mm-hmm. They're framed back, and then long sheets of rock are passed through.
Yeah.
So it is quite possible. So I think that the answer here, besides the Myron Ferguson as the answer, if you want to know more about this, the answer here is actually quite simple. It's the same as any other part of the air barrier. The connections and the penetrations are the difficult challenges. Mm-hmm. They're going to be more difficult to deal with if you haven't thought about them until the very last second. And doing it in as large a sheets as possible or as large of assembly pieces as possible is your greatest opportunity for success.
2 more quick things. You can get the seal with the sheet good drywall with either a sealant, right, that between the framing and the drywall, or a gasket. And I honestly don't know which one works better. That's something to consider. And I think the most important thing is, no matter what your air barrier is or air control air, if you're not testing it with a blower door, don't even bother, especially your first times going through it. The feedback that you're going to get from the blower door is so glaring that's way better than that's way more useful information than what you chose to use to get the continuous air control air.
I can agree with that completely. Now, an opportunity to read out loud. Peter, I believe that you have a question that you're going to provide us.
I do.
Let's see the
So this is our good friend Ian Keller. He was one of the attendees at the very first Fine Home Building Summit. There's a little video about his experience there. He's a homeowner who is working on a couple of houses and was totally enthralled with all the building science when he went to the Fine Home Building Summit. So we've stayed in contact with him over the years. So his question is, would you treat an above grade masonry wall any differently than a basement wall? That is with respect to insulation. I know Steve always says to insulate basements on the interior and transition to exterior insulation at the sill. I guess he means at the mud sill.
Mm-hmm.
My thoughts on what else to consider, other than what Steve recommends: greater heating and cooling load above grade than below grade, and solar vapor drive is a bigger issue above grade than low grade if it's a masonry wall system. I think one of the things about basements that I always hear is that the loads are much lower below grade than they are above grade. So, you use less R value insulation. But Steve, you care to throw in on this about moving the insulation from the inside below grade to the exterior above grade if they're both masonry assemblies?
I mean, insulation, I don't think I really have a difference. Like, we can still insulate it. The problem I have with a masonry foundation wall is the water management of it, not the thermal management. I don't think the thermal management, any of my decisions would be altered because we're doing concrete masonry block versus concrete.
But you feel very strongly about insulating below grade masonry walls interior.
Yeah, I do. And it's for the same reasons I do on the outside. It's when you break grade, it's a challenge. And I don't think I don't have a successful, I know some people think they do. I don't have a successful solution that I like there. There might be some situations where it's close, like it is perfectly flat land and it's only, 9 or 10 inches that we have to cover. But those conditions are so rare that it's hard.
Ian knows that this is exactly what I did on our 120-year-old house in Brattleboro. We insulated with open cell spray foam on the interior of the basement. And then when we got above grade, we switched to closed cell spray foam as a retrofit on the concrete block.
On the outside.
And I paid dearly for the fact that when I jumped from inside below grade to outside above grade, I thought, there's probably a water table detail block that's continuous. And that'll act as an air barrier transitioning from the interior to the outside. And the first time I got a chance to look at the actual construction of the water table detail, it was cored just like the blocks. So I have this convective loop that runs like 14 feet from below grade to above grade in my building. And that really pissed me off.
Yeah.
Well, the best part about that is Peter sold that house. He don't live there no more.
Somebody else's problem. But typically now you'd have a bond beam in that location. I mean, if we were doing it, we'd have that.
Yeah. Good point.
And the thing is I remember being in Ohio and they did concrete block foundations extensively and seeing drilled holes at the bottom of the wall. And I said, it's really interesting. Why do you drill the holes there? And the builder's like, so drain the water out, of course.
Jeez.
And I was like, okay.
Then what do you do with it?
Yeah, I guess, when the block gets wet, good thing we got the holes drilled at the bottom because that lets all the water out.
Wow.
Interior side?
Yeah. That was the answer.
And were they drilled?
And I'm not even going to tell you who the builder is, but
were they drilled above the concrete slab or below?
Yeah, they're above the concrete slab, like just above it.
Well, that's water
like,
management.
Not an occupied basement, obviously.
Yeah. So, anyways.
Okay. So our next question is basically, I've been looking at frost protected shallow foundations, and I would like to hear the pros and cons of frost protected shallow foundations.
Say it real fast.
So I did. That was as fast as I could say.
Good job.
So I would like to start with saying, hey, Peter, can you give us a definition for frost-protected shallow foundations?
So this is a code-approved approach to taking a slab and fanning an apron all the way around so that the soil that is next to the slab stays above freezing temperature. And you basically ground couple the slab to ground that is skirted with insulation to protect it from freezing. And
Hold that thought for a second.
yeah,
Because here's one of my questions about frost protected slabs. You say you ground couple the slab.
yeah.
Now, in the very earliest of frost protected shallow foundations, you would insulate on the outside of whatever said stem wall is and then extend it horizontally out.
Correct.
Now, people have put insulation in under the slab. So
I've seen that detail a couple times.
So you're not using the house energy
Right.
to put into the ground in that detail. But I was always under the impression that originally frost protected shallow foundations, when in their earliest day, when it was explained to me, was you're using the house to help heat the ground, and you've extended the insulation spectrum a little further, and you're using the ground to keep the house from.
I think the answer to this is that in the code, there's very explicit how far you have to fan out, how the R value of that apron changes from climate. It's linked to soil freezing indexes as well as to
And
climate.
there's more at the corners. I remember seeing that. The corners get fanned out more than the middle of the wall.
And interestingly, when I started the NHP Research Center in 1993, they were in the middle of doing all the research in cold climate, northern states to support the evidence that was coming from Scandinavia, because Scandinavia had been doing shallow frost protected foundations for quite a while, and it was just moving that technology.
But did they truly couple the slab with the ground, or did they insulate it?
My memory is that key to the approach was that you do not insulate underneath the slab. You're using the ground coupling as both an advantage when when it's warm enough that you can not be dumping all the interior heat to that space, and then of course it's an advantage during the summer. But so I can see that, especially both you having worked on passive house or near passive house projects, they completely decouple any of the concrete assembly.
So then I question, are you really keeping the ground warm on the outside, or are you allowing
warm is a stretch?
Yeah. That you might not really be frost protecting it like you think you are.
So I think one answer to this is there's a section of the code that is incredibly explicit about exactly how to do these shallow frost protected foundations per different climate conditions, air freezing index. They have maps for all of these in terms of how you do it and how you get data for how to do it in your area. To me, it seems that heat transfer is going to be somewhat related to the nature of the soil and its water content. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how that factors in, but I think the best answer we can give is it has been researched. The rules are in the code. I know that the last time I looked into this, modeling ground coupling heat transfer is incredibly difficult to do. And so when you hear Mark Rosenbaum go into an argument with the guy from Passive House from Europe about, the fellow saying to Mark Rosenbaum, why do you hate insulation? Because Mark is arguing about you're nuts to put in R20 underneath a basement slab. The delta T that far in the soil is like barely makes R5 worthwhile doing. And a lot of that has to do with it's difficult when you have a huge sink that can just keep moving the energy way. It's a difficult thing to model.
So my understanding, for frame of reference, like you brought up, is the Great North. That's where this comes from. We're putting in less concrete. We're less worried about permafrost or freeze thaw. And I'm not sure if I see a benefit to it in our market from a like how we normally build works out okay, asking people to provide warranties on differing assemblies, even though they're code approved. Do
The
you
place I think it works the best and where I would consider it a very positive or have a real favorable argument for its use is if it was very rocky, ledgy soil, where if you dug down 16 or 18 inches and you hit rock, then I think that would be a really good
or maybe
solution for
incredibly high water table.
or an incredibly high water table.
Yeah, the other thing that's always concerned me is that maybe if you go far enough north, you don't have to worry about termites in your insulation. But I know that when we did the research at the center, it was all plastic rigid insulation. And you would think that this approach would make more sense when it's not all that cold, right? Because then the impact of being ground coupled is less.
Yeah, the delta T between the soil temperature in your houses.
But I have to admit, I have never worked on a shallow frost protective foundation approach to buildings. So I just know that if I ever had to, I would go right to the code because it's laid out in painstaking detail.
And Steve, you haven't done one?
I did at Building Science Corporation, and it was on heavily laden, like rocky. That's why they made that comment. Is because that's where we did it.
It also makes me think about, I know it's a completely different assembly, but it's the same idea. You and I had emailed, Peter, you and I emailed back and forth multiple times a couple of years ago about a company from Europe that was selling EPS foam that you laid out, and then it had EPS that went vertically at the perimeter, and then you poured your slab inside of it, and that was it. It just laid on top of It just laid on top of the ground. And I mean, I guess that's Alaska. Many places up there, the house just kind of sits on top of the ground, sort of thing.
We have that company up by us, Branch River Plastics. I believe they can make that stuff. But you see it, it's like a giant L where it has, and you basically build a bathtub,
and then you just pour inside that, and now you have your building, and you're not doing anything except for just scraping a little vegetation away.
Yep.
I just think that if you have a slab that's completely thermally connected to the earth, how is that slab not, close to dew point, depending upon the interior conditions in the house? So, I don't know. I've never been a big fan.
It's close to dew point on the far side. On your side, the system hopefully is keeping it at 70 or 72. So there's...
For three guys who have done one project, we're offering an awful lot of information.
Yeah. So you heard it here first. Or second or third.
We have done one, and how long ago was the one that you were involved with?
We should have titled this section.
Was it this century?
How deep is your knowledge of shallow frost protected
But it's not the only question. Let's move on to the next question.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, you know what? Let's move on.
Okay, so this one actually, again, came through Instagram. Jeff sent me this question. I've published, let's talk about the video that I published, and that'll phrase this question. So I published recently on Build Show Network a video about roof penetrations. About we have multiple rules that we're trying to apply to our buildings. Number one is if we're going to have roof penetrations, we're going to do our best to, while adhering to code, to limit the number of penetrations in total. So rather than just let the apprentice plumber show up and go, well, here's a sink, we should vent above that. Here's a toilet, we should vent above that. Here's a shower, we should vent above that. And having 5 or 6 roof penetrations for a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen, thinking about what's the maximum number of fixtures that we can put on one vent and eliminating as many of those vents as possible. That's step 1. Step 2 is the location of the vent. No longer does the plumber have sole control and sole power over where the vent actually penetrates the roof. If you look at, especially in the neighborhood that I live in, there are quite a few 60s ranches. There are some houses, I believe even one of the ones across the street, that there is clearly a 3-inch vent in an interior or an exterior wall above the front door. So like there has to be a bathroom on the front side of the house. They vented in the exterior wall and it goes up through the plate and then through the roof. And now that penetration is in a bad spot for the wall because we're killing all the insulation, but it's also in the worst spot that we could put it for the roof. Meaning,
I don't know if it's about the worst spot.
Sorry.
I have that one photo where I drove by and had to stop and take a picture. They put the vent in the valley.
Yeah. So, meaning the worst
Isn't
spot.
that like a gutter? Isn't it like collecting the downspout?
Yeah.
Yeah. That they put the roof penetration basically as low as possible as they could.
Yeah.
And it's going to see not only the rain that falls directly on top of it, but all the rain that falls uphill on that roof. So they put it in the most challenging location that you could possibly put it. So we're going to try to make all of our roof penetrations in the upper third, and we're just using that as our simple rule.
Yep.
The plumber can understand what that is without too much argument. And then 3, we're going to use air admittance valves where possible. So we're not going to poke a hole, period, if we don't have to. The air admittance valve does not let sewer gas in. It lets vacuum pressure draw air into it, but not let any air out. And we can vent sometimes a third of the house or half the house or 3/4 of the house on a couple air admittance valves and then get away from having a roof penetration. And then if we can't do all of that, if we have the opportunity, penetrating a sidewall. So
I just don't get it. Why would you put a hole in your roof anywhere if you could side vent? It just makes so much sense that that's going to see so much less moisture or precipitation than if I put a hole in the roof.
And so that side vent is where the question comes in. The what we talked about in roof penetrations is if we come out under an overhang, we go past the overhang and we turn upwards, and then we adhere to the how far past the roof deck does the vent actually have to protrude. Then we have the opportunity to say, this is where it's venting, it's meeting code, and we didn't poke a hole in the roof. Jeff's question was, if it goes up and then it goes horizontal and it turns and it brings the water back to the house, how is that any different than a roof penetration? Steve had a comment about the ability to still vent because we're putting in an extra 90 potentially,
You
right?
increase some pressure there.
We do, but we're talking about a very low pressure assembly for the venting because if you look at how we use the air admittance valve, there's very little that gets through.
Yeah,
there.
we're talking about pressure relief for vent. Is it a vent stack?
Yes,
Yeah.
for plumbing vents. It's not much pressure.
Yeah, well, if you're not actively moving air and you're just waiting for it to wander on its way out, yeah, it's incredibly low pressure.
So then that's number 1. It's still a valid point. It's just I'm not particularly worried about it. But number 2, now I have a vertical assembly that the water could get to. I'm way less worried about a completely vertical assembly because of how quickly it will drain versus a sloped assembly that has some texture to it. And number 3, it has an overhang on it. Like we're not that spot does not get challenged because it's a vent, we have the ability to add negative slope away from the house or positive slope away from the house so that the thing comes out and goes down a little bit before it makes its 90-degree up. It's not running back uphill to get to that point. We're not worried about that water. We're detailing it with good quality tape or a liquid sealant of some sort.
I hate to diverge a little bit, but I understand there's still places where you're not allowed to use air admittance valves.
There are.
That's insane. How long have they been around and legal in so many places? I've never heard of an air admittance valve failure like, hey, I'm getting sewer gas in my house.
So I talked to Eric Gani about it. Eric is a plumber in Minneapolis, and that is one of the municipalities. And
where they don't allow them?
Where they don't allow it.
Oh.
And I would think that like the further north you get, the more sense it might make. You know, you're not connecting that vent through through your attic into the outside and potentially letting in negative 40-degree air into your wall assembly in the form of that pipe. So
did he have any response as to why they're not?
I didn't pry. I just thought, that's the same sort of thing as if you go to St. Louis, you have to use cast iron for all of your drain lines. Well, that's a union. The union plumbers pushed to keep the cast iron because they wanted to get. My understanding of it is, sorry for any plumbers in St. Louis. If I'm offending you by saying it sounds to me like the union has taken hold and, lobbied to get something that is completely outdated.
Yeah. Interesting.
Held in the code for their benefit.
It's interesting that when you look at the sort of environmental profile of piping, the cast iron comes out pretty poorly because you have durability issues. It's pretty hot, energy intense and doesn't last nearly as long as some of the other materials.
Do you have a comment on the horizontal connection to that pipe to a wall?
No, the only, I think one of the issues, and I'm going to play architect-y here for a minute, like coming out right underneath a soffit on a roof on the gable end and then turning upward. Like, I almost want to see the pipe lower in the wall than right underneath the soffit. Right underneath the soffit looks like it was a mistake.
I when you were describing it, I thought, I'm kind of surprised that we would move outside the gable to go up rather than just going up through the roof near the ridge. I thought we were talking about, frankly, exhaust vents, not plumbing vents, but that's my problem.
Yeah, but even a plumbing vent, I think I would be inclined to like have a couple pipes come out the gable end, something like 2 feet below the rake, and then turn and have a taller pipe, which you instinctively think maybe that would be uglier, but it would look certainly more intentional than the short one that comes out and only turns up 16 inches.
I wonder if you came just above ceiling joist out and then up 2 feet, if there would be enough
so there's
diffusion
no
before it goes up to the soffit and catches. I guess you could, in that instance, you could solid vent the soffit.
So the question is, so why does a bath fan allowed to come out a vent? Like, why couldn't I bring my plumbing vent up and just exhaust it out a dryer vent pipe?
I think one's under pressure and the other is not.
Okay, but they're both exhausting to the outside.
Yeah, but it's being pushed away from the building as opposed to coming to the edge of the building and wandering its way up.
Yeah, I'm not convinced it's pushing it away from the building. It's pushing it out. Away from the building is a stretch for me.
What we need to do is get the theatrical fogger out. That's what we need to do. And get some wing nut testing on this whole thing.
Do we have another question before we
that
get
was a question.
Pete's squeaky voice or whatever?
That was
scary voice. Scary voice.
Pete's squeaky
you
voice
frighten pretty easily, buddy.
only comes out when there's mice.
Done? Is that what you're talking about?
That was 4 questions, and we're at the 20.
Because I wanted to tell you about what I did last night.
Wait, we have are we saying our Pete's resources, Myron Ferguson and Airtight Drywall?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
I like the way I get sometimes to pick Pete's resource.
Resource.
Often plural.
Resources.
Yeah. Pete's other resource for this episode is the November 1990 publication of Hustler. It's his favorite because one of his letters got published.
Now I'm looking forward to your closing comment.
So last night I drank holy water with some laxatives. Yeah. Today I'm about to have a religious movement.
Thanks.
I didn't think it was possible to go much lower than your Hustler comment, but you're working on it.
I'm trying.
Okay. Well, Steve, you were hosting. Do you want to take us out?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, Unbuild It Podcast, keep sending in those questions. Q&As are obviously very slowly becoming our favorite. It gives us, Peter, Jake, and myself, the opportunity to share in the discussion rather than provide some type of lecture type environment.
Yeah.
So
Here.
it's great. Keep sending them in. And likewise, I would like to add that not only send in questions, but send in and let us know if you like where this goes.
Okay, and now that you can hear dogs barking in the background because somebody must be pounding on the office door at the other end of the building, we want to say thank you for listening. And we'll call it that.
It's a wrap.